Hey everyone, Sumo Spiffy here. It's finally time for the tier list recap for Kyushu 2023, a chance to look at what we expected before the basho and talk about how it went down, especially with regards to guys who performed well outside those expectations. A few things before we start. 1. A couple of people have now asked about putting these online. I couldn't figure out how to link directly to the tier list, but in writing this script I realized I should just be able to take a picture and stick it on Imager or something like that. So we'll do that going forward. Second, with the adjusted ranking system, here's roughly how we'll decide whether a pick was accurate or not. There wasn't anyone at S or A, but in theory, wrestlers will stay there if they have 10 or more wins, and S also requires being best in their Banzuke bracket. So, Maegashira 1 to 5, 6 to 10, etc. B requires 8 to 10 wins, C plus is 7 to 9, C minus is 6 to 8, and D is 6 or fewer. To move someone to S requires 11 or more wins and being clearly the best pick in at least their section of the Banzuke. What best pick means will kinda depend on circumstances, but 2 more wins than anyone else in their bracket is probably a good rule of thumb. Moving to A just requires 11 wins. B through D are mostly the same. A guy can move to B with 9 or 10 wins rather than 8 to 10, C plus is still 7 to 9, C minus is still 6 to 8, and D is 5 or fewer. As always, this is somewhat flexible, but it offers a good starting point and a reason to explain adjustments in more depth if we move someone outside of these guidelines. Third, and you may have noticed if you watched the release of the tier list, I got rid of the nicknames on the pictures and put their normal names in a more readable font. Hopefully some of the longer names are big enough. If they're not, let me know in the comments and I'll try to find another way of dealing with that later. Alright, tier list, let's go. Starting at the top. Of course, Terunofuji wasn't fighting and is in his honorary S injury tier spot. His coach apparently said he's definitely fighting in January though, so let's see if that sticks going forward. A lot of these B tier guys performed exactly to the winning record, maybe 10 wins expectation. Nephew and Papa Bear did get 10 wins, Battle Hamster and Daisho, I need a good nickname for Daisho. Anyway, they got 9, and Matakayumi finished his Kachikoshi on day 13. Asanoyama missed the first week, but still came back remarkably well given his injuries, and Nishiki Fuji's second week and surprisingly difficult schedule make me just slightly willing enough to let him keep his injury pass. With the adjustments, for what I hope are obvious reasons, Kirishima goes straight to S tier. This is the kind of performance he showed he's consistently capable of in the 3 basho run that got him to Ozeki, but it's always a question of when, or sometimes if, a guy will return to form after an injury. Even though travel reportedly caused him some back trouble, you wouldn't have known it in the ring because he blasted everyone after day 6. Kotonowaka wasn't quite as far ahead of the lower Sanyaku as Kiri was ahead of the Ozeki, but he still scored 11 wins despite a disastrous loss to Ryuden, and the only other winning record amongst the Sekiwake and Komusubi was Daisho's 9 and 6, so an adjustment to S tier seems correct for him. As for Wakamoto Haru, I've been basically saying since he hit the Sanyaku that it's a great achievement, but skill-wise he's still at least a half step behind everyone else in the upper echelon. He managed to hold a Sanyaku position for a year with solid performances, but he did it by getting 1 or 2 wins per basho against guys he normally struggles with, and a schedule he could otherwise handle. This time, the wheels all fell off at once. The schedule got tougher with the rise of Takayasu for one. He'd never been competitive with Asanoyama, so Asanoyama's withdrawal looked like a good thing. However, he ended up with Gonoyama, someone he'd never faced, and got completely handled. Then Asanoyama came back and whooped him anyway. His 50-50 matchups went 50-50, and he didn't appear injured. He'll remain competitive near the top of the division, but this wasn't bad variance working against him. This is roughly what we should expect in the future, rather than another run of 7 straight winning records or anything like that. Hopefully he'll learn some new tricks that allow him to make another good stay in the Sanyaku and make me look silly, but his game hasn't really expanded since he came on the top division scene, so it's on him to prove he can still grow as a wrestler. And then at the end we have Tomokaze. I picked him to have a strong basho, and he started well, but straight up, I never saw that he was wearing a boot last tournament. Maybe I'd have picked him anyway, since he obviously did fine with it on, I don't know. In any case, he clearly wore down over the 15 days, and almost literally limped home with a 7-8 record. I feel comfortable having placed him at B, since I'm sure he'd have had a Kachikoshi if his health had maintained a bit longer, but we have to knock him down to C+. C+ was the over 50% chance of having a winning record level, and most of these guys were exactly that. Tobizaru, Nishikigi, and Shonen Naomi all finished 7 and 8, so they just missed. Nishikigi, in fact, started out so hot that even when he got blasted by some Sanyaku guys, he ended up switching from them to the contender pack, so his life stayed real hard for week 2. Gonoyama, Kinbozan, and Oho all had 8 wins, and Gonoyama actually had to beat Shonen Naomi on day 15, so they were the most C+ picks of all. Hiradeumi, Tamawashi, and Tsurugisho all finished with 9 wins, and even though sometimes they could be adjusted to B tier, that requires seeing a realistic possibility they could have hit 10 wins that just didn't pan out for some reason. In this case, it's hard to tell how any of them would have gotten there. It took everything from Hiradeumi to get to 9, and Tsurugisho's comeback from a knee injury that looked like it could knock him out of the tournament was incredible on its own. Tamawashi might have the best argument for any guy who could have gotten to 10, but his losses were all to tough opponents, which I never thought I'd call Churanaumi that before the Basho, but anyway, so C+ still looks right. For the movers, Abi and Takarafuji make a small drop to C- on 6 and 9 records. I thought they'd done enough at their respective ranks to show a little bit more faith in them, but neither of them looked like they ever had a great chance at a winning record. Onosho gets an injury marker because his knees were obviously a gigantic problem, but with 3 wins, we still have to say he should have been D tier. Ryuden had a very Ryuden tournament, beating who he knows he should, fighting through tough matches more than a lot of guys, but that stunning win over Kotonowaka pushes him to B tier. And then there's Ichi Yamamoto. Definitely the most wrong I was about anyone by far, although I called the first part of his character arc. He came out strong against competition he just proved he could beat in September and blitzed to an even better record than I expected. But when he got scheduled against Daisho, it looked like things were going to go south again. That's when the arc broke. The schedule got easier almost immediately, probably thanks to his loss to Hiradeumi, but I'd still never have expected him to beat Nishikigi, Ryuden, and Kinbozan. So big props to the ex-cop for a spectacular run in Kyushu. For you Ichi fans though, I have to break some news to you. Ichi was a beneficiary of some pretty early jumps against Nishikigi and Kinbozan that didn't get called as false starts, and he was timing other guys as well. His overall success wasn't strictly due to getting a step on his opponents, I'm not saying that, but it did a lot of work for him, and his opponents will be ready next time. If they get their fists down with a quick movement, they can negate a lot of that advantage. Plus, Midori Fuji's Henka was completely set up by him baiting Ichi's strategy of getting the fastest possible start. It's frankly absurd that Kinbozan didn't have a tactic in place to deal with it on day 15. Ichi could actually do okay next Basho if he ends up against a lot of guys who somehow don't notice him doing this, or comes up with a secondary plan that's just as good, but coming up with a first plan as good as this one is already hard enough. If they're all ready for him, it's gonna be a rough ride. C- included the guys who I thought would struggle to get a winning record, but at least had a chance at it. If nothing else, at least I mainly predicted the bads as being bad, but most were even worse than anticipated. For the ones who stay in place, Shodai pretty much epitomized the concept of a C- type of record with his 6-win wet fart of a Basho. Similarly, Hokuseiho basically showed the limits of having big tall on your side and little else. Myogiryu struggled as expected, and Sadanoumi needed a couple of frankly astonishing wins against Tatami Fuji and Ichi Yamamoto to finish 8 and 7. Takanosho was 5 and 5 when he pulled out with an injury, so we'll leave him here with an injury tag. Most of this group gets tanked down to D tier though. Hokuto Fuji struggled as much as expected, with his first loss to Tobizaru in 9 meetings being the outlier that pushes him down a notch. Endo, Roga, and Kitanowaka all finished with 5 wins, so they also just missed staying at C-. Meisei generally struggles at this level, but what makes it sometimes work out for him is his ability to ramp up his game against higher level guys. He did beat Takakeisho, but the rest of the tournament was a disaster. And even though we'll give Kotoeko an injury tag, he was 2 and 7 when he got hurt, which is at least tending towards D-level performance. Midori Fuji is the only C- pick who gets elevated out of the tier. This was also the one pick where looking his probable schedule over ahead of time may have given a clue a good outing was in store because he had a ton of favorable matchups early on. Frankly, he made it look easy. This was straight up a bad read on my part, C+ for him. And lastly, we've got D tier. Toha Kuryu was as bad as expected. That slappy pushdown game when you're one of the smaller guys is just not a method for finding extensive success. Chura no Umi was shockingly good, especially considering he only got 3 of his 9 wins off his fellow Juryo promotees. His only 2 losses in the first 9 days were to Ichi Yamamoto and Tsurugisho, both of whom finished really well. In fact, all 6 of his losses were to guys who finished with winning records. Even if this was to some degree the effect of a favorable schedule, he showed out more than I think most of us expected, so credit to him for that. He gets a bump to C+. And then Ura. I mean, pinch me, I'm dreaming, right? There was zero expectation he'd beat Kiri, Nephew, Hamster, Daisho, or Wakadu, and right on schedule he started 0-5. His win against Kotonowaka was as phenomenal as it was unlikely, but Takayasu then put him at 2-6. Then, with the hard part of the schedule out of the way, he went on a 6-1 run to finish and put himself at Komosubi in January. D tier looked completely accurate until he found a way to make it wrong. We do need to pay attention to one thing though. He won every match he was supposed to. He's good against Meisei, Hokuto Fuji, Shodai, and Onisho. He'd won his only previous match against Gonoyama, and obviously Hokuseiho is beatable. He usually struggles against Abi, so that was a nice win despite Abi not having a great tournament, and obviously the Kotonowaka win was outstanding, and that just squeaked him through to 8-7. I'll talk about his expected schedule in the tier list for January since I don't want to kill the high too much, but let's just appreciate what happened and what it'll mean if he's able to maintain the rank for another Basho. Okay, that's it for the tier list recap. Sorry for the massive delay, it took longer than expected to get my voice back to a state where I could talk this much. Guess the Banzuke video comes out in the next couple of days. Remember, the deadline is December 18th, which is 4 weeks before the Basho rather than 3. Get your guesses in. Other than that, have a great day, and I'll see you soon.